This is Neima Novetsky from al-hatorah.org. Today's TorahCast will explore the purpose of the institution of Shemittah, the sabbatical year, perhaps one of the most difficult mitzvot to properly observe in the entire Torah. The laws of Shemittah are discussed in three different places in the Torah, in Shemot chapter 23, Vayikra chapter 25, and Dvarim chapter 15. Both Shemot and Vayikra speak of Shemittah Ta'aretz, the prohibition against working the land in the seventh year, and the obligation to permit the entire populace to partake in its produce, while Dvarim speaks of Shemitat Ksafim, the commandment to forgive all debts. In both Shemot and Dvarim, the sabbatical year is presented as geared towards social welfare, with a focus on how it is meant to aid the poor and needy. Thus, Shemot emphasizes, V'hashvi'it tishmetena unitashta, v'achelu evyonei amecha, and in the seventh you shall let it rest and lie fallow, and the needy of your people may eat. Similarly, in Dvarim, the context of the command is the ever-present poor and the need to aid them. Patoach tiftach et yadacha la'achicha la'aniyacha u'le'evyoncha. Vayikra 25, in contrast, makes no mention of the poor, highlighting instead how the year is meant to be a Shabbat for Hashem, the land, and the people at large. The emphasis is not on helping the poor, but on how this year is somehow for God and the land itself. What, though, does it mean that the year shall be a Shabbat for God? How does refraining from sowing or forgiving debts affect Hashem? Moreover, how does this portrait, which appears to view the mitzvah as between man and God, bin adam lamakom, relate to the portraits in Shemot and Dvarim, which present it as a mitzvah bin adam l'chaviro, a law guiding interpersonal relations? The institution of Shemittah is mentioned in an additional noteworthy context. In Vayikra chapter 26, which lists the various blessings and curses for observance or transgression of mitzvot, the lack of observance of Shemittah gets special mention, being singled out as the root cause of the nation's ultimate exile. Az tirtzeh ha'aretz et shabbatoteha, kol yemei hashama, v'atem be'eretz oivechem. Kol yemei hashama tishpot et asher lo shavta, b'shabbatotechem b'shiftachem aleha. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath as long as it lies desolate and you are in your enemy's land. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, even the rest which it didn't have in your Sabbath when you lived on it. The final chapter of Divrei Hayamim records the fulfillment of this admonition, sharing how the people were exiled and were to stay there ad ratzta ha'aretz et shabbatoteha, until the land had been compensated for her Shabbatot, for all those years that the people did not observe the mitzvot of Shemitah. These verses make us wonder why, of all of the Torah's cardinal prescriptions, is the violation of Shemitah viewed with such severity, and why does it have such enormous consequences? When delving into the purpose and centrality of the commandments related to the sabbatical year, commentators tend to focus on either the account in Vayikra or those in Shemot and Dvarim, and to reinterpret one in light of the other. As such, a first approach focuses on the verses in Vayikra and concludes that the purpose of the mitzvah must be to promote recognition of Hashem. The Shemitah year is intended to remind the nation of God's sovereignty and providence and make them aware of their dependence upon Him. As it is a mitzvah which requires a tremendous display of faith in Hashem, it is an ideal vehicle for strengthening that belief. This positioned starting point is the description of Shemitah as a Shabbat for Hashem. Many commentators point to the numerous parallels between the two institutions, concluding that both serve as a reminder that Hashem created the world and that He is sovereign over it and all of mankind. Besides the obvious parallel in the use of the common name Shabbat, each of Shabbat and Shemitah revolve around cycles of 7, in which the first 6 units of time are devoted to labor, particularly working the land, and the 7th to abstaining from it. Both commandments further emphasize the resting of the slave and maidservant. Finally, Shaddai notes that just as the Israelites received a double portion of manna on the 6th day of the week in anticipation of Shabbat, so too Hashem promises that the land will produce enough in the 6th year to sustain the nation through the Shemitah year. In the wilderness, the weekly break from manna and the double portion on Friday help the people not take Hashem's supernatural providence for granted. Similarly, the sabbatical year reminds the people that even once they are living in their own land, their natural sustenance continues to derive from Hashem. While this position assumes that all the various laws of Shemitah, refraining from sowing, leaving one's produce for the taking, and the releasing of debts, all reinforce the general message of dependence on Hashem and recognition of His sovereignty, It is the break from working the land which perhaps most obviously helps to achieve these goals. Commentators point out the numerous ways in which it does so. The Sefer HaChinuch underscores how abstaining from agricultural work requires extraordinary trust in Hashem, deepening one's dependence upon and faith in Him. This teaches man that it is not by his strength alone that he succeeds, but rather due to God. The Kli Yakar further points out how in refraining from work, people in effect relinquish their ownership on the land, helping them to recognize that Hashem is the true owner of the land. As Hashem says later in the chapter with regards to the similar institution of Yovel, Kili Haaretz. Rav Yitzchak Arama further suggests that the forced break from work teaches people to distance themselves from materialistic pursuits and to recognize that service of God, not the land, should be their primary goal. Ibn Ezra and Rav Yosef Bar Choshor take this idea one step further, suggesting that the year promotes this idea not just conceptually, but practically as well. The forced leave of absence from work gives people the time to delve into Hashem's Torah and devote themselves to Him, something they likely do not have the time or energy to do when engaged in agricultural labor. Interestingly, according to both of these commentators, the mitzvah of Hakel, the public reading of the Torah, takes place at the beginning rather than at the end of the sabbatical year, appropriately introducing this year as one which should be devoted to learning. This position suggests that even the other laws of Shemittah, which at first glance appear to be aimed at aiding the poor, are really lessons in trust and recognition of God as well. The sharing of produce and canceling of debts remind all that it is Hashem rather than man who owns everything. Both commandments further force one to suffice with less and not to succumb to materialistic desires. Finally, by relinquishing control over one's crops and sharing in them equally with the poor, one recognizes that all of mankind is equally dependent on Hashem for sustenance. According to these sources, Shemitah is singled out in the blessings and curses and is punished so severely because the commandment is so fundamental to belief. Ramban asserts that in not observing Shemitah, one is in effect denying that Hashem created the world, and that a negation of such a cardinal principle merits a harsh punishment. The choice of exile specifically might further be seen as a measure-for-measure punishment. If man assumes that he, rather than Hashem, is the true owner of the land, he needs to be expelled from it in order to learn his proper place. A second approach to the mitzvah focuses on the laws of Shemitah as outlined in Shemot and Devarim, concluding that the commandment is about man's relationship to his fellow man rather than to God. Shemitah is meant to teach people to have mercy on those who are less fortunate and to emphasize the equality of all of mankind before Hashem. Rav Avram Saba suggests that the mitzvah teaches an important lesson in empathy. Normally, the wealthy are complacent in the knowledge that they are well provided for and rarely think of those who do not share this security. In the Shemitah year, when the rich are forced to abstain from working the land, they learn what it feels like to worry about providing for their families. This teaches them to empathize with the poor and to care for them, not only during the Shemitah year, but all the time. Shadal further points to the equalizing aspect of having both rich and poor together refrain from work. When everyone rests together, the lines that separate the classes are blurred. These messages are taught mainly through the leaving of produce for the poor and canceling of debts, rather than from the cessation from agricultural work. When we forsake our produce, the socio-economic differences between rich and poor are reduced. For 1 year, all have the same rights to the crops in the field and all go together to collect their food. This allows the poor to obtain food with dignity. The forgiving of debts plays the same equalizing role in an industrial society that forsaking of crops does in an agricultural one. In addition, in a sabbatical year where the poor might be harder hit than the rich, cancellation of debts might be particularly helpful. Rav Yosef Bar Choshor adds yet another aspect to the year. Even though most commentators assume that the law that one must free a slave in the 7th year refers to the 7th year from his sale, Rav Yosef Bar Choshor uniquely suggests that the commandment refers to the sabbatical year. If so, this granting of freedom promotes another aspect of social equality. How, though, do these commentators understand the perspective on Shemitah highlighted in Sefer Vayikra, the laws regarding the prohibitions of sowing, and the reference to Shemitah as a Shabbat for Hashem? Shadal suggests that the many parallels to Shabbat actually serve to remind man not only of God, but also that all men are equal. On Shabbat, master and servant refrain from work and rest together. So too, during the sabbatical year, not only do landowners rest, but so do their slaves. Ze'ev Jabotinsky more recently addressed this social welfare aspect of Shemittah and the equalizing benefits of the forced break from agricultural work. He noted that the 7-year Shemittah cycle and the Jubilee year combine elements of both capitalism and socialism, allowing for checks and balances between the two systems. For 6 years, a free market economy allows for growth and competition, while the 7th year tries to ensure that the pitfalls of such a system, the large gaps between the rich and poor, are avoided. Given this understanding of Shemittah, this position might suggest that violation of the mitzvah is punished so severely because not caring for the poor and disadvantaged is inexcusable. Caring for the other is fundamental to maintaining a healthy society, and when it is lacking, people are undeserving of Hashem watching over that society. Elsewhere too, exile and destruction are promised as punishment for taking advantage of the poor and enslaved. In Yirmiyahu chapter 34, for example, the prophet tells the nation that they will be killed by sword and plague and taken to Babylonia for refusing to free their slaves in the 7th year. Rambam suggests one last way of looking at the Shemitah year, which he himself admits might not stand on its own, but is nonetheless an important aspect of the year. Shemitah is meant to be not just a Shabbat LaHashem, but a Shabbat LaAretz, a Sabbath for the land. The sabbatical year serves a practical function in keeping the land healthy and capable of bearing fruit. According to Rambam, the ceasing from work serves a utilitarian function, giving the land time to rest and replenish its nutrients so that it can better produce in the future. The other laws of Shemitah are practical solutions to the difficulties that not working the land might cause. Produce is free for the taking to ensure that all have what to eat, even though no one has worked the land. Since during the Shemitah year, the poor might be more hard-pressed than usual, a special dispensation is made to cancel their debts. Several commentators have attacked this understanding of the mitzvah, maintaining that Hashem's commandments are meant to guide man to moral perfection, not to serve mundane utilitarian purposes. Rambam, though, is consistent in suggesting that some of Hashem's laws might be simply practical in nature. For example, he views kashrut as a means of protecting Israel's health, and the incense as a deodorizer meant to rid the tabernacle of undesired odors. The Akedat Yitzchak, though, further questions, why, if this commandment is meant only to ensure a fruitful land, are there so many warnings regarding its observance? And why is the punishment for its violations so severe? One would have thought that the land's lack of production itself would have been the offender's punishment rather than exile. A possible response to this question, though, is that the mitzvah is not merely utilitarian, but also meant to promote environmental awareness and the need to care for the land. Hashem gave the land of Israel as a gift to the nation and expects them to treat it well. If they do not, perhaps the measure for better punishment is that they no longer deserve to benefit from it and are expelled. In summary, Shemitah teaches important lessons in recognition of Hashem, caring for the less fortunate, and caring for the land. It promotes equality among people and teaches all to depend on Hashem. These lessons, of course, are ones which we should keep in mind not just every sabbatical year, but every year, all year long, as the weekly mini Shemitah of Shabbat reminds us. For more on this topic and other topics related to Parashat Bahar, please visit al-hatorah.org.